There comes a moment in a man's life when he realizes that every door he's ever opened has led him to exactly where he was meant to be, even when that place looks like the end of everything. Harold Ruiz felt that crushing weight of destiny as he stood in the overgrown backyard of his foreclosed house in Millbrook Valley, Oregon, holding a sledgehammer in his trembling hands and staring at the ancient stone wall that shouldn't have existed behind his garage. The wall bore symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and behind it lay a sealed chamber that would reveal a $380 million secret so profound it would freeze his blood and change not just his life, but potentially rewrite human history itself. What would you do if saving your family meant unleashing something the world wasn't ready to know? Before we dive into Harold's incredible journey, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story captures your imagination, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have an even more mind-bending tale that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Harold Ruiz had always believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle life threw at you. At 47, he had spent the last 23 years building a modest but successful landscaping business in the rain-soaked valleys of western Oregon. Ruiz Landscape Solutions wasn't much to look at, just Harold, his beat-up truck, and whatever seasonal workers he could afford. But it had provided a decent living for his family and earned him a reputation as the guy who could make any yard beautiful, no matter how hopeless it seemed. The business had been his pride, built from nothing after he'd immigrated from Honduras as a young man with empty pockets and dreams bigger than the mountains surrounding his new home. He'd learned English by reading gardening magazines at the public library, studying the names of plants and trees until he could discuss soil composition and drainage systems with the confidence of someone born to the trade. His weathered hands told the story of 2 decades spent coaxing life from reluctant earth, and his modest success had felt like proof that America still rewarded those willing to work for their dreams. But the economic downturn had hit small businesses like a sledgehammer to glass. Construction projects disappeared overnight, and homeowners who had once paid for professional landscaping began mowing their own lawns and planting their own flowers. Harold's client list shrank from 47 regular accounts to 12, then to 7, then to just 3 elderly customers who hired him more out of pity than necessity. The business that had taken him 23 years to build crumbled in 18 months, leaving him with equipment he couldn't sell and debts he couldn't pay. The foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a postal worker who wouldn't meet Harold's eyes as he handed over the certified letter. The house on Clearwater Road, the first property Harold had ever owned, the place where he'd planned to grow old with his wife Esperanza, would be sold at auction in 60 days unless he could produce $47,000 in back payments and penalties. Harold had stared at that number until the digits seemed to mock him. $47,000 might as well have been $47 million for all the chance he had of raising it. Esperanza had been heartbroken but supportive, as she'd been through every challenge of their 19-year marriage. She worked double shifts at Valley Memorial Hospital, her nursing salary now their only reliable income. But even with her overtime pay, they were barely covering basic expenses. Their daughter, Gabriella, 16 and brilliant, had started talking about skipping college to get a job and help the family. The thought of his daughter sacrificing her future because of his failures kept Harold awake most nights, staring at the ceiling and wondering where he'd gone wrong. The house itself had been a source of pride and mystery since they'd bought it 8 years earlier. Built in 1923 by a reclusive historian named Professor Aldrich Vanstone, it sat on 5 acres of densely wooded land that backed up against the Cascade Mountain foothills. Vanstone had been an eccentric figure in local history, known for his expeditions to Central America and his collection of pre-Columbian artifacts. According to local stories, he designed the house with unusual features: rooms that served no obvious purpose, walls that seemed thicker than necessary, and a basement that appeared smaller from the inside than the house's dimensions suggested. Harold had always dismissed these stories as small-town folklore, but lately he'd been paying more attention to the property's oddities. The garage, for instance, sat 20 feet from the main house but had been built against what appeared to be a natural stone outcropping that rose from the hillside behind it. Harold had always assumed the stones were part of the mountain's geology, but recent heavy rains had washed away decades of accumulated soil and vegetation, revealing something that made his hands shake as he examined it more closely. The exposed stone wall bore carved symbols that definitely weren't natural formations. Geometric patterns intertwined with what looked like astronomical symbols, all surrounding what appeared to be a sealed entrance marked with warnings in multiple languages. Some of the script looked Mayan, others resembled Egyptian hieroglyphs, and still others used symbols Harold didn't recognize at all. Most unsettling were the newer inscriptions, carved in English with dates from the 1920s. Professor Vanstone's careful warnings about the dangers of disturbing what lay beyond the stone barrier. "Not to be opened without proper understanding," read one inscription. "The knowledge within exceeds the wisdom of any single generation." Another warned, "What sleeps here has slept for good reason. Ensure you are prepared for what awakening might bring." Harold's practical mind told him he was looking at an elaborate hoax, perhaps a Depression-era project by an eccentric professor with too much time and money. But something deeper, something that connected to ancestral memories he couldn't quite access, whispered that the symbols meant exactly what they appeared to mean, that behind this wall lay something ancient, powerful, and potentially dangerous. Standing in his backyard with the foreclosure notice crumpled in his back pocket and a sledgehammer in his hands, Harold faced the choice that would define the rest of his life. He could walk away, let the bank take the house, and spend the next decade rebuilding his life from nothing. Or he could swing that hammer, break through the stone barrier, and discover what Professor Vanstone had thought worth hiding behind warnings carved in stone. The symbol seemed to pulse in the fading afternoon light, and somewhere behind the wall, Harold could swear he heard something that sounded almost like breathing. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, Harold Ruiz stood at the threshold between his old life and whatever lay beyond that ancient stone barrier, knowing that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Harold Ruiz had once been the kind of man other immigrants pointed to as proof that the American dream still existed for those willing to chase it with bleeding hands and an unbreakable spirit. 25 years earlier, at 22, he had crossed the border with nothing but a tattered backpack containing 2 changes of clothes, his grandmother's wooden crucifix, and a letter of recommendation from Father Miguel in his hometown of Valle Verde, Honduras. The letter, written in careful English, vouched for Harold's character and work ethic, though it couldn't prepare him for the reality of starting over in a country where his engineering degree from Universidad Nacional meant less than his ability to distinguish weeds from flowers. Those early years in Oregon had been a masterclass in humility and determination. Harold's first job was picking strawberries in the Willamette Valley. Bent over rows of plants from dawn to dusk for wages that barely covered rent on a shared trailer with 5 other workers. His engineering background meant nothing in the fields, but his mathematical mind helped him optimize picking patterns and calculate the most efficient routes through the endless rows. By his second season, crew leaders were asking for his advice on productivity improvements, recognizing an intelligence that transcended language barriers. The transition to landscaping had been born from necessity and observation. During strawberry off-seasons, Harold had taken whatever work he could find: construction cleanup, warehouse loading, restaurant dishwashing, but it was a chance encounter with an elderly Italian gardener named Romano Benedetti. Romano, whose own family had immigrated 3 generations earlier, recognized something in Harold's careful attention to plants and his intuitive understanding of how living things responded to patient care. "You see the soil like it's telling you stories," Romano had told him one autumn afternoon as they worked together on a residential project. "That's not something you can teach. That's something you're born with or you're not." Romano became Harold's unofficial mentor, teaching him the difference between ornamental grasses and invasive weeds, showing him how to read soil composition by feel, and introducing him to the wealthy homeowners in West Hills and Lake Oswego who valued craftsmanship over cheap labor. The business expansion had been carefully planned and responsibly financed. Harold had started with his own labor and a borrowed truck, gradually adding equipment and seasonal workers as contracts justified the expense. By 2018, Ruiz Landscape Solutions employed 8 full-time workers year-round and twice that number during peak season. Harold had purchased the company's first new truck, a gleaming Ford F-350 with Ruiz Landscape Solutions professionally painted on the sides in forest green letters that matched the company's business cards and website. More importantly, success had allowed Harold to provide for his family in ways that still amazed him. Esperanza, whom he'd met at English classes at Portland Community College, had been able to pursue her nursing degree without the financial stress that crushed so many working families. Gabriella had grown up in a stable home with parents who were present for school events and family dinners, never knowing the uncertainty that had defined Harold's own childhood in Honduras. The house on Clearwater Road had represented the culmination of Harold's American journey. When they'd purchased it in 2015, Harold had walked through every room with the wonder of someone who still couldn't quite believe his own success. 5 acres of Douglas fir and maple trees, a house with solid bones and character, and enough space for Gabriella to have friends over without neighbors complaining about teenage laughter. Harold had spent weekends restoring the property's gardens, applying his professional expertise to his own land, with the satisfaction of someone who had earned the right to call a place home. The economic collapse had started with small signs that Harold had initially dismissed as temporary market adjustments. A few clients mentioned tightening budgets and reducing service frequency. New contract inquiries slowed from several per week to 1 or 2 per month. But Harold had weathered economic downturns before, and his established client base had always provided stability during uncertain times. The real devastation came when the stability he'd counted on evaporated almost overnight. Dr. Patricia Hayworth, his largest residential client, whose estate required 2 full days of maintenance weekly, called on a Monday morning to cancel her contract effective immediately. Her husband's medical practice had been sold to a larger group that didn't need his services, and they were downsizing to a condominium. Within 2 weeks, 3 more major clients had made similar announcements. Job losses, divorces, relocations, and business failures that Harold realized were symptoms of a much larger economic crisis. By Christmas 2022, Harold's crew had shrunk from 8 employees to 3, and he'd been forced to sell the new truck to make payroll for his remaining workers. The professional equipment that had once filled a dedicated storage facility now sat unused in his garage, representing thousands of dollars in depreciating assets he couldn't afford to maintain but couldn't bear to sell at bankruptcy prices. The psychological impact of failure had been harder to bear than the financial consequences. Harold had built his identity around being the provider, the man who could solve problems through determination and skill. Watching his business collapse despite his best efforts felt like a personal indictment of everything he'd believed about hard work and perseverance. The immigrant success story he'd embodied for 2 decades was unraveling, and with it, his sense of who he was supposed to be. Esperanza had never blamed him for the downturn, but Harold saw the exhaustion in her eyes as she picked up extra shifts to compensate for his lost income. Gabriella had stopped talking about college visits and started researching community college programs she could afford while living at home. The family conversations that had once centered on vacation plans and home improvement projects now focused on which bills could be delayed and which expenses were absolutely necessary. Standing in his backyard with the foreclosure notice in his pocket, Harold understood that the carved stone wall behind his garage represented more than just an archaeological curiosity. It was potentially his last chance to reclaim the role of provider and protector that had defined his adult life, even if fulfilling that role meant venturing into territory that defied everything his practical mind told him was possible. The symbols on the wall seemed to mock his desperation, ancient warnings carved by people who understood that some solutions came with prices too high to calculate in advance. Harold had always believed that the strength of a family could be measured by how they faced adversity together, but watching his personal failures tear apart the people he loved most was teaching him that some burdens were too heavy to share without causing permanent damage. The kitchen table conversations that had once revolved around Gabriella's academic achievements and weekend plans now carried an undertone of careful worry, with each family member trying to protect the others from the full weight of their collective fear. Esperanza bore the heaviest burden beyond Harold's own. Her nursing shifts at Valley Memorial Hospital had expanded from 3 days a week to 6, often involving double shifts that left her exhausted but determined to keep their basic expenses covered. Harold watched her leave for work at 5:30 each morning, her scrubs crisp and professional despite the weariness in her eyes, and return home 12 hours later with feet swollen from standing and shoulders tight from stress she refused to acknowledge. She never complained, never suggested that Harold wasn't doing enough, but she could see the calculation behind her carefully neutral expressions as she sorted through bills and prioritized which payments could wait another month. Their marriage, strong enough to survive the normal stresses of raising a family and building a business, was showing stress fractures under the constant pressure of financial uncertainty. Conversations that should have been about their daughter's future or their own retirement dreams instead focused on immediate survival strategies. Esperanza had suggested twice that Harold consider taking a job with one of the larger landscaping companies, working for wages instead of struggling to maintain his failing business. But Harold couldn't bring himself to admit that 23 years of independence had led to him begging for employment from competitors who had watched his decline with a mixture of sympathy and relief. The pride that had driven Harold's success now poisoned his ability to accept help or make rational decisions about their situation. When Esperanza's sister Carmen had offered to loan them money to catch up on mortgage payments, Harold had refused with an abruptness that sparked their first real argument in years. "We don't take charity from family," he had declared, as if maintaining his dignity was more important than keeping their home. Esperanza stared at him with an expression he'd never seen before, disappointment mixed with something that looked disturbingly like contempt. "Your pride is going to cost us everything," she had said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had finally reached the limit of her patience. "Gabriella's future, our home, our marriage, all of it sacrificed so you can feel like the man you used to be instead of dealing with the man you are now." Those words had hit him like physical blows, partly because they were unfair, and partly because they contained enough truth to make his chest tight with shame. He wasn't the same man who had built Ruiz Landscape Solutions from nothing, and pretending otherwise wasn't protecting his family, it was endangering them. Gabriella's response to their financial crisis had been the hardest for Harold to witness. At 16, she possessed the kind of natural intelligence that had always made her parents' sacrifices feel worthwhile. The bright mind that justified every overtime shift and deferred vacation. Her grades had remained stellar despite the tension at home, but Harold noticed changes that broke his heart in ways he couldn't articulate. She had stopped asking for new clothes or money for school activities, instead wearing the same few outfits in careful rotation and declining social invitations that required spending money her parents didn't have. More devastating was watching Gabriella assume responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. She had taken a part-time job at a local coffee shop, lying about her availability for shifts so she could work more hours than labor laws typically allowed for minors. Her earnings, carefully saved in a jar hidden in her closet, were intended to help with college expenses that everyone knew the family couldn't afford. Harold had discovered the money one evening while looking for a phone charger in her room, and the sight of those crumpled bills had made him sit on her bed and cry for the first time since his father's funeral. The college conversations were the most painful. Gabriella had always dreamed of studying environmental science at Oregon State University, inspired partly by Harold's work with plants and landscapes, and partly by her own passion for protecting the natural world. Her grades and test scores would have made her competitive for significant scholarships, but even with financial aid, the costs were beyond their current means. Harold had watched his daughter research community college programs with the same enthusiasm she had once brought to university catalogs, and her determined cheerfulness about saving money on general education requirements felt like accusations against his failure to provide. "I can always transfer later," Gabriella had told them over dinner one evening, her voice bright with forced optimism. "Lots of successful people start at community college. It's actually smarter financially." Harold had nodded and smiled, playing along with the fiction that this was a choice rather than a consequence of his inability to maintain the stability she had grown up expecting. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their financial collapse. Friends who had once invited the Ruiz family to backyard barbecues and holiday gatherings seemed to sense their changed circumstances and offered fewer invitations, as if poverty might be contagious. Harold suspected the awkwardness was more about their friends' discomfort with witnessing downward mobility than any deliberate cruelty, but the result was the same, a growing sense that they were becoming invisible to the community they had once been part of. Esperanza's nursing colleagues had been more supportive, offering practical help like hand-me-down clothes for Gabriella and invitations to potluck dinners that didn't require expensive contributions. But Harold struggled to accept even these kindnesses, his immigrant pride interpreting charity as confirmation of failure rather than expressions of genuine care. He had worked so hard to prove himself worthy of respect that accepting help felt like admitting he had been fooling himself and everyone else about his capabilities. The foreclosure notice had crystallized all these relationship tensions into a single, unavoidable crisis. Harold had initially tried to hide the severity of their situation, telling Esperanza and Gabriella that he was working on solutions and exploring options, without specifying that those options ranged from desperate to impossible. But the 60-day deadline made secrecy unsustainable, and the family meeting where Harold finally admitted the full scope of their financial crisis had been one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Gabriella had listened to the details with the kind of calm attention that made Harold realize his daughter was already more mature than many adults he knew. "So, we're going to lose the house," she had said, not asking a question but confirming a reality she probably understood before Harold was ready to admit it. "Where will we live?" The practical questions that followed about school districts, about Esperanza's commute to work, and about what they could afford for rent with damaged credit demonstrated how completely their old life was ending. They weren't just losing a house, they were losing the stability and predictability that had allowed them to plan for a future that now seemed impossibly distant. Standing in his backyard that evening, Harold understood that the mysterious stone wall behind his garage represented more than just an escape from financial ruin. It was potentially his last chance to restore his family's faith in him as someone who could solve problems and provide security. The symbols carved in the ancient barrier seemed to pulse with possibility, offering hope that felt both miraculous and terrifying. The breathing sound behind the wall had grown more distinct as darkness fell, and Harold realized that whatever lay beyond those stones would either save his family or destroy what remained of their trust in his judgment. Some gambles were too dangerous to take, but others were too important to avoid. The discovery of Professor Aldridge Vanstone's hidden study changed everything Harold thought he understood about the property he was about to lose. 3 days after finding the carved stone wall, while desperately searching the house for anything valuable enough to sell, Harold had been measuring the basement walls to confirm his suspicions about the building's unusual dimensions. The interior basement was definitely smaller than the house's exterior footprint suggested, which meant there had to be hidden space somewhere within the structure. Harold's engineering background, dormant but not forgotten after decades in landscaping, had kicked into analytical mode as he examined the basement's construction. The foundation walls were built from massive stone blocks that seemed far more substantial than necessary for a simple residential basement. More intriguingly, one section of the east wall showed subtle differences in mortar color and stone texture, as if it had been modified or sealed after the original construction.
When Harold pressed his ear against this section, he could detect a hollow sound that suggested empty space beyond. The hidden mechanism that revealed Professor Vanstone's secret study was so cleverly designed that Harold might never have found it without the detailed architectural knowledge his engineering education had provided. A seemingly decorative stone carving near the basement ceiling, when rotated exactly 90 degrees clockwise, triggered a counterweight system that caused a 4-foot section of the wall to swing inward on concealed hinges. The mechanism operated silently, despite decades without maintenance, testament to the professor's understanding of both engineering principles and the need for absolute secrecy. Professor Vanstone's study was a time capsule that had been sealed since 1924, preserved in perfect condition by the dry basement environment and the professor's meticulous preparation for extended absence. The room contained floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with books about ancient civilizations, archaeological excavation techniques, and pre-Columbian cultures. Detailed maps of Central America covered every wall surface, marked with locations, dates, and cryptic notations in multiple languages. But it was the professor's personal journals and research materials that revealed the true scope of his obsession with what he called the Thornfield collection. According to Vanstone's meticulously maintained records, he had spent 15 years investigating reports of a hidden chamber that contained artifacts gathered by a secretive organization called the Thornfield Society. This group, active during the late 1800s and early 1900s, had been composed of wealthy American industrialists and European archaeologists who privately funded expeditions to acquire rare artifacts from ancient civilizations around the world. Unlike legitimate archaeological societies, the Thornfield Group operated in absolute secrecy, removing priceless objects from their original contexts and transporting them to hidden repositories throughout North America. The society's members had included railroad barons, steel magnates, and shipping industry titans who possessed both the financial resources to fund expensive expeditions and the political connections to move sensitive materials across international borders without attracting official attention. Their private collections, assembled without regard for legal ownership or cultural significance, represented some of the most valuable archaeological treasures ever removed from their original locations. But the society had disbanded abruptly in 1903, following a scandal involving the death of several indigenous guides during a particularly aggressive acquisition expedition in Guatemala. Professor Vanstone's research had revealed that the Thornfield Society's final act had been to consolidate their most valuable acquisitions in a single, heavily secured location where the artifacts could be preserved until political climates allowed for their eventual display in private museums. The Society's records, which Vanstone had somehow acquired during his own expeditions, indicated that this consolidated collection had been sealed in a specially constructed chamber beneath his property in 1904, 20 years before he purchased the land and built his house above it. The professor's journals documented his growing obsession with accessing the Thornfield chamber while wrestling with the moral implications of what he might find. Vanstone had been a legitimate scholar whose academic reputation was built on ethical archaeological practices and respect for indigenous cultures. But his research into the Thornfield Society had revealed that their collection included artifacts of incalculable historical and monetary value, objects that could advance archaeological understanding by centuries if properly studied, but which had been acquired through methods that violated every principle of responsible scholarship. Vanstone's internal conflict was evident in journal entries that alternated between excitement about potential discoveries and anguish about benefiting from cultural theft. The knowledge contained within those chambers could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations, he had written in 1923, but accessing that knowledge makes me complicit in the crimes that gathered these treasures in the first place. How does one balance the advancement of human understanding against the perpetuation of historical injustice? The professor had spent months developing what he called ethical protocols for handling whatever he might find in the Thornfield chamber. His plans included detailed documentation of every artifact, research into their original cultural contexts, and eventual repatriation to appropriate institutions or indigenous communities once political situations allowed for such actions. But Vanstone's journals revealed that he had ultimately died before implementing these plans, leaving the chamber sealed and his moral dilemmas unresolved. Harold's hands shook as he read the professor's final entries, written just days before Vanstone's death from a sudden heart attack in 1924. The chamber entrance is concealed behind the stone barrier I have constructed in the hillside, he had written. The symbols carved into the barrier are not decorative. They are warnings and instructions written in languages that the Thornfield Society's scholars documented during their expeditions. The knowledge necessary to safely open the chamber and handle its contents responsibly is contained within this study, waiting for someone with both the wisdom to understand the moral complexities involved and the courage to act on that understanding. The detailed maps and architectural drawings in Vanstone's study revealed the full scope of what lay beneath Harold's property. The Thornfield chamber was actually a complex of interconnected rooms carved directly into the bedrock beneath the hillside, accessible through the sealed entrance behind Harold's garage, but extending much deeper into the mountain than the simple stone barrier suggested. The Society's engineers had designed the complex to be completely self-contained, with ventilation systems, drainage, and climate control that would preserve organic materials indefinitely.
Most significantly, Vanstone's research included detailed inventories of the Thornfield collection's contents, compiled from the Society's own records and supplemented by the professor's scholarly analysis of their cultural and historical significance. The collection included Mayan astronomical instruments that could reveal previously unknown details about pre-Columbian scientific achievements, Incan goldwork that demonstrated metallurgical techniques lost to history, and Aztec codices that contained linguistic and cultural information unavailable in any known surviving documents. The monetary value of the collection, calculated using 1920s market prices and updated in Vanstone's final notes, was estimated at over $380 million in contemporary terms. But the professor had been more concerned with the collection's intellectual value, noting that several individual pieces could rewrite entire chapters of archaeological understanding if properly studied and documented. Harold sat in the hidden study until dawn, reading through journals and maps that revealed not just the location of extraordinary treasure, but the moral burden that came with possessing knowledge of its existence. Like Professor Vanstone before him, Harold found himself confronting questions that had no simple answers. The Thornfield collection could solve his family's immediate financial crisis and provide security for Gabriella's future, but accessing it would make him complicit in cultural crimes committed over a century earlier. The breathing sounds behind the stone barrier had grown stronger during the night, as if something within the chamber was responding to Harold's presence in the study. Professor Vanstone's final warning echoed in Harold's mind as morning light filtered through the basement windows. The chamber will open for those who understand the full weight of what they are about to inherit, but once opened, it can never be closed again, and the responsibility for what lies within becomes yours for the rest of your life. Standing at the threshold between desperate poverty and potentially devastating wealth, Harold realized that Professor Vanstone had left him more than just instructions for accessing the Thornfield collection. He had left him the same moral dilemma that had consumed the professor's final years, along with the terrifying freedom to choose how that dilemma would define the rest of his life. Harold's engineering mind, which had lain dormant during years of focusing on soil composition and plant biology, awakened with fierce intensity as he began to decode Professor Vanstone's research methodology.
The hidden study contained not just historical records and moral philosophy, but a sophisticated system of cross-reference documentation that revealed the professor's scientific approach to validating the Thornfield Society's claims. Vanstone hadn't simply accepted the Society's inventory records at face value. He had spent years developing independent verification methods that would prove or disprove the collection's existence and authenticity. The professor's validation process began with geological surveys that he had conducted secretly around his property during the 1920s. Using equipment that was cutting-edge for its era, Vanstone had mapped the underground rock formations and cave systems that extended beneath the hillside. His detailed charts showed natural limestone caverns that had been artificially expanded and reinforced with precisely cut stone blocks, creating chambers large enough to house the Thornfield collection while protecting it from seismic activity and groundwater infiltration. Harold studied these geological maps with the same analytical focus he had once brought to civil engineering projects, recognizing the sophistication of the Thornfield Society's construction methods. The chamber complex had been designed by engineers who understood principles of load distribution, drainage, and climate control that wouldn't be widely known for several more decades. The artificial cave system represented a feat of early 20th century engineering that rivaled anything Harold had seen in his professional training. More compelling were Vanstone's archaeological correlations, which connected specific artifacts mentioned in the Thornfield records to legitimate museum pieces and documented historical discoveries. The professor had spent years corresponding with museums and universities throughout Europe and the Americas, discreetly inquiring about missing pieces from known collections and unexplained gaps in archaeological records. His research revealed a pattern of mysterious disappearances that coincided exactly with the Thornfield Society's expedition schedules and acquisition targets. The validation process extended to financial records that Vanstone had somehow obtained from defunct banks and estate liquidations connected to Thornfield Society members. These documents revealed enormous expenditures for research expeditions and specimen acquisition that far exceeded anything legitimate archaeological societies could afford. The money trail painted a picture of systematic cultural plunder that operated on an industrial scale, with individual expeditions receiving funding equivalent to millions of dollars in contemporary purchasing power. Vanstone's correspondence files contained letters from indigenous community leaders throughout Central America, many written in response to the professor's careful inquiries about objects that had disappeared from their villages during the early 1900s. These testimonies provided heartbreaking accounts of sacred artifacts being stolen from ceremonial sites and family shrines, often accompanied by violence against anyone who attempted to prevent the thefts. The professor had documented dozens of specific cases where Thornfield Society expeditions had left communities devastated by the loss of irreplaceable cultural treasures. The authentication methods that Vanstone had developed were decades ahead of their time, incorporating techniques that wouldn't become standard archaeological practice until the 1960s. He had studied the Thornfield Society's own documentation methods, learning to recognize their cataloging systems and authentication markers. More importantly, he had developed what he called provenance mapping, a process of tracing individual artifacts back to their original cultural contexts through linguistic analysis, artistic style comparison, and historical correlation. Harold's respect for Professor Vanstone grew as he studied the scholar's meticulous approach to verification. Rather than rushing to access the chamber based on the Society's claims, Vanstone had spent years building a comprehensive understanding of what the collection should contain, how it had been acquired, and what its discovery would mean for both archaeological scholarship and the communities from which it had been stolen. The professor's research represented a masterclass in responsible investigation that transformed Harold's understanding of what lay beneath his property.
The technical challenges of accessing the chambers safely became clearer as Harold studied Vanstone's engineering notes. The stone barrier behind his garage wasn't just a decorative entrance. It was a sophisticated locking mechanism that required specific knowledge to operate without triggering protective measures designed to preserve the chamber's contents. The Thornfield Society's engineers had incorporated multiple fail-safes that would seal the chamber permanently if anyone attempted to force entry without understanding the proper procedures. Vanstone's research revealed that the carved symbols on the stone barrier were functional rather than decorative, serving as both warnings and instructions for anyone knowledgeable enough to decode their meaning. The professor had spent months learning to read these symbols, studying similar markings from authenticated Thornfield Society sites throughout North America. His translation notes indicated that the barrier's opening sequence required specific tools, precise timing, and knowledge of astronomical alignments that occurred only at certain times of year. The breathing sounds that Harold had been hearing behind the wall were explained by Vanstone's technical diagrams of the chamber's ventilation system. The Thornfield engineers had designed an ingenious air circulation system that drew fresh oxygen from surface vents concealed throughout the hillside, while expelling stale air through natural fissures in the rock. The rhythmic sound pattern indicated that the system was still functioning after more than a century, testament to the quality of its construction and the stability of the underground environment. Harold's investigation extended beyond Vanstone's research to modern resources that the professor couldn't have accessed. Using his satellite internet connection, Harold began cross-referencing the Thornfield Society's members with contemporary historical databases and genealogical records. What he discovered painted an even more disturbing picture of systematic cultural exploitation that had been hidden from public view for over a century. Several Thornfield Society members had been prominent figures in American industry whose philanthropic legacies were built on foundations of cultural theft. Museums and universities that bore their names had been unknowingly founded with money earned from artifacts stolen from indigenous communities throughout the Americas. The Society's influence had extended into government circles, with members holding positions that allowed them to manipulate import regulations and archaeological permits to facilitate their illegal acquisition activities. The contemporary value assessment that Harold conducted using modern auction records and museum insurance evaluations confirmed Professor Vanstone's estimates while revealing that the collection's worth had grown far beyond what the professor had calculated. Individual pieces that the Thornfield Society had acquired for thousands of dollars were now worth millions, while complete artifact sets that they had removed intact from ceremonial sites represented cultural treasures that contemporary museums would consider priceless. Harold's research into repatriation law and indigenous rights revealed the complex legal framework that now governed the return of stolen cultural property to its rightful communities. International treaties and domestic legislation that hadn't existed during Vanstone's era provided clear guidelines for handling discoveries like the Thornfield collection, but they also established legal responsibilities that could expose anyone who accessed the chamber to criminal liability if the artifacts weren't handled according to proper protocols. The validation process that Harold completed over the course of 2 weeks transformed his understanding of what he was facing. This wasn't a simple treasure hunt that might solve his financial problems. It was an encounter with one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history, accompanied by moral and legal complexities that could destroy his life if handled incorrectly. Professor Vanstone's research had provided the knowledge necessary to access the chamber safely, but it had also revealed the enormous responsibility that would come with that access. As Harold sat in the hidden study on his final evening of research, surrounded by evidence that confirmed both the collection's existence and its devastating cultural cost, he understood that Professor Vanstone's real legacy wasn't the instructions for opening the chamber. It was the comprehensive understanding of what lay within and the moral framework necessary to handle that discovery responsibly. The professor had spent his final years preparing for a responsibility he never got to fulfill, leaving Harold to inherit not just the location of extraordinary treasure, but the wisdom necessary to bear the weight of possessing it. The chamber's entrance would open tomorrow night, when astronomical conditions matched the requirements encoded in the stone barrier's ancient symbols. Harold had all the knowledge he needed to access the Thornfield collection, but Vanstone's research had made it clear that opening the chamber would be the easy part. Living with what he found inside would define the rest of his life. The night Harold chose to open the chamber, circumstances conspired to eliminate every alternative path his life might have taken. Earlier that day, Esperanza had received notice that her hours at Valley Memorial Hospital were being reduced due to budget cuts, slashing their only reliable income by 40% just 3 weeks before the foreclosure deadline. The hospital's financial crisis meant that even her excellent performance record couldn't protect her from layoffs that were hitting the nursing staff across all departments. Gabriella had come home from school with news that the coffee shop where she worked part-time was closing permanently, the owner unable to compete with the new corporate chain that had opened 2 blocks away. Harold watched his 16-year-old daughter discuss job hunting with the grim determination of someone twice her age. Her college fund jar now empty, as she had quietly contributed her savings to help with grocery expenses. The sight of her carefully updating her resume for minimum wage positions that would interfere with her studies made Harold's chest tight with shame and rage at his own helplessness.
The final blow came in an evening phone call from Harold's last remaining landscaping client, Mrs. Alina Fitzpatrick, an elderly widow whose garden had been Harold's responsibility for over 8 years. Her voice was apologetic but firm as she explained that her children had convinced her to move to an assisted living facility, effective immediately. The monthly maintenance contract that had provided Harold's only steady income would end with the house sale, leaving him with no clients, no prospects, and equipment he couldn't afford to maintain. Harold sat at his kitchen table that evening, surrounded by bills that exceeded their remaining resources by thousands of dollars, and realized that conventional solutions no longer existed. Every responsible option had been exhausted, every reasonable approach had failed, and every safety net had proven inadequate to prevent their fall into poverty. The foreclosure notice remained 18 days away, but their practical ability to prevent it had already expired. Esperanza had retreated to their bedroom after dinner, claiming fatigue but actually avoiding conversations about their impossible situation. Harold could hear her quiet phone call with her sister Carmen, discussing temporary housing arrangements that neither woman wanted to make explicit. The prospect of his family becoming homeless while he remained paralyzed by indecision was more devastating than any risk the chamber might contain. The decision crystallized as Harold stood in his backyard at midnight, holding the specialized tools that Professor Vanstone's research had indicated were necessary for opening the barrier safely. The carved symbols on the stone wall seemed to pulse with their own inner light under the full moon, and the breathing sounds from within the chamber had grown so distinct that Harold could count individual inhalations and exhalations. Whatever lay behind the barrier was definitely alive and apparently aware of his presence. Harold's engineering background had taught him to calculate risk versus reward, and the mathematics of his current situation made the choice devastatingly simple. The certain outcome of inaction was homelessness, bankruptcy, and the destruction of his family's future. The uncertain outcome of opening the chamber included possibilities ranging from death to discovery of treasures worth hundreds of millions of dollars. When survival was at stake, even dangerous uncertainties became preferable to guaranteed disaster.
The symbolic weight of his choice wasn't lost on Harold as he began following Professor Vanstone's instructions for opening the chamber. He was literally breaking through barriers that had been designed to protect secrets from people like him, desperate individuals whose circumstances might drive them to make choices that more stable people would consider insane. The carved warnings on the stone barrier had been placed there by people who understood that desperation could overcome wisdom, and Harold was proving their point even as he ignored their cautions. The physical process of opening the chamber required Harold to abandon his last connection to his former life. The specialized tools necessary for manipulating the barrier's locking mechanisms included several pieces of his professional landscaping equipment, precision measuring devices, soil analysis tools, and metal detection equipment that represented thousands of dollars in business assets. Using these tools to break into an ancient chamber meant destroying their resale value and eliminating any possibility of rebuilding his landscaping business through conventional means. Harold's hands shook as he positioned the tools according to Vanstone's detailed diagrams, following procedures that felt more like performing surgery than conducting archaeological excavation. The professor's research had revealed that the barrier's opening mechanism was designed to respond only to specific combinations of pressure, rotation, and acoustic resonance applied in precise sequence. A single mistake could trigger defensive systems that would seal the chamber permanently, making this Harold's only opportunity to access whatever lay within. The sounds from behind the barrier changed as Harold began the opening sequence, shifting from rhythmic breathing to what sounded almost like anticipatory stirring. Something within the chamber was definitely responding to his activities, exhibiting awareness that suggested intelligence rather than simple animal instinct. Harold's rational mind insisted that he was probably hearing mechanical sounds from the chamber's ventilation system, but his deeper intuition recognized communication patterns that implied conscious observation. As Harold worked through the complex opening procedure, he found himself thinking about Professor Vanstone's moral framework and wondering whether his own desperation justified actions that the professor had considered ethically questionable. Vanstone had spent years developing protocols for handling the chamber's contents responsibly, but he had also enjoyed financial security that allowed him to prioritize ethical considerations over immediate survival needs. Harold's circumstances offered no such luxury of moral contemplation. The moment when the barrier finally began to move was both mechanical and mystical, accompanied by sounds that seemed to emerge from the stone itself rather than any visible machinery. Ancient counterweights and leverage systems, preserved by the dry underground environment, activated with surprising smoothness despite decades of inactivity. The stone panels that Harold had assumed were solid barriers revealed themselves to be carefully balanced doors that swung inward to expose darkness that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. The air that emerged from the chamber carried scents that defied Harold's ability to categorize. Metallic elements that might have been gold or copper, organic compounds that suggested preserved wood and fabric, and underlying fragrances that reminded him of incense or ceremonial smoke. More unsettling was the temperature differential that created visible air currents as the chamber's atmosphere mixed with the cool night air, indicating that the sealed environment had maintained different conditions for over a century.
Harold's final moment of hesitation came as he stood at the threshold between his known world and whatever lay beyond the barrier. Behind him stretched a life of failure and approaching homelessness. Ahead lay possibilities that ranged from salvation to destruction. The breathing sounds from within the chamber had stopped completely, replaced by silence so profound that Harold could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. The choice to cross that threshold represented more than just physical movement. It was Harold's acceptance that his old life was ending regardless of what he found in the chamber. Whether the Thornfield collection contained treasures worth millions or dangers that would kill him, Harold Ruiz, the failed landscaper, would cease to exist the moment he stepped into the darkness. What emerged would be someone fundamentally changed by contact with secrets that had been hidden for over a century.
As Harold took his first step into the Thornfield chamber, leaving the moonlit world behind and entering the preserved darkness of the Thornfield Society's final repository, he understood that Professor Vanstone's warnings had been accurate. The chamber would indeed open for those who understood the full weight of what they were about to inherit. But once opened, it could never be closed again. Harold was about to discover whether that inheritance would save his family or destroy everything he had left to lose. Harold's first steps into the Thornfield chamber revealed a world that challenged every assumption he had made about what lay hidden beneath his property. The underground complex extended far beyond what Professor Vanstone's maps had suggested, with corridors and chambers carved from living rock that created a subterranean palace designed to house treasures beyond imagination. The air inside carried a strange quality that seemed to preserve not just physical objects, but something more ethereal, as if time itself moved differently in the carefully controlled environment. The initial passage descended gradually through precisely cut stone that showed tool marks unlike anything Harold had seen in modern construction. The Thornfield Society's engineers had possessed techniques for working with rock that created surfaces so smooth they felt almost polished, yet maintained enough texture to provide secure footing even after decades of accumulated moisture. Emergency lighting systems, powered by some mechanism Harold couldn't identify, activated automatically as he moved deeper into the complex, casting a warm, golden glow that revealed architectural details impossible to appreciate with flashlight illumination alone. 20 feet into the complex, Harold encountered the first of many obstacles that demonstrated the Thornfield Society's sophisticated security measures. A heavy bronze door blocked further progress, its surface covered with inscriptions in multiple languages and secured by a locking mechanism that required specific knowledge to operate safely. Professor Vanstone's research had prepared Harold for this barrier, providing detailed instructions for manipulating the combination of symbols, pressure points, and rotating elements that would grant access to the chamber's deeper levels. The lock's operation required Harold to demonstrate understanding of astronomical principles that the Thornfield Society had incorporated into their security design. Specific constellations had to be recreated using movable bronze elements, while corresponding mathematical calculations were input through a series of numbered dials. The process took nearly an hour to complete, with Harold cross-referencing Vanstone's notes against the complex symbol system while working in lighting conditions that made precise manipulation challenging. As the bronze door finally swung open with a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the underground chambers, Harold was greeted with evidence that Professor Vanstone hadn't been the only person to access the Thornfield complex during the 20th century. Fresh footprints in the stone dust, recent tool marks on metal surfaces, and modern equipment scattered throughout the entrance chamber indicated that others had discovered the collection's location and conducted their own investigations within the past few years. The most disturbing discovery was a leather journal dropped near the entrance, containing entries dated just 6 months earlier from someone who signed themselves as Dr. Miranda Ashworth, Archaeological Consulting Services. Ashworth's notes revealed that she had been conducting systematic surveys of the Thornfield collection on behalf of an unnamed client, documenting specific artifacts and assessing their market value for potential acquisition. Her final entries indicated growing concern about complications that had made continued access to the chamber dangerous. The collection's guardians are not simply preservation systems, Ashworth had written in her last journal entry. There is intelligence here that responds to human presence with increasing hostility toward those it deems unworthy. The artifacts themselves seem to evaluate intruders, and those found lacking face consequences that extend far beyond physical danger. I am terminating this contract immediately and strongly advise that the chamber be sealed permanently.
Harold's unease about Dr. Ashworth's warnings intensified as he progressed deeper into the complex and began encountering the preservation systems that had maintained the Thornfield collection for over a century. These weren't simple climate control mechanisms, but sophisticated biological and technological hybrid systems that seemed to blend organic components with mechanical elements in ways that defied Harold's understanding of either ancient or modern engineering principles. The chamber walls were lined with what appeared to be living crystalline formations that pulsed with bioluminescent light in response to Harold's presence through the corridors. When Harold stood still for more than a few seconds, the crystal formations would intensify their examination, producing harmonic frequencies that he could feel as much as hear. More unsettling were the mechanical guardians that Professor Vanstone had only briefly mentioned in his research notes. These devices, roughly humanoid in shape but clearly artificial in construction, stood motionless in alcoves throughout the chamber complex until triggered by specific movement patterns or proximity to protected artifacts. Harold's first encounter with an active guardian occurred when he inadvertently stepped too close to a display case containing Mayan ceremonial masks.
The guardian that emerged from its alcove moved with fluid grace that seemed impossible for a mechanical device, its bronze and steel construction somehow allowing for organic-seeming motion that reminded Harold of predatory animals stalking prey. Its head, shaped like a stylized eagle, turned to track Harold's movements while its torso remained perfectly still, creating an effect that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The device made no aggressive moves, but its presence conveyed an unmistakable message about the consequences of unauthorized interference with the collection. Harold's progress through the chamber complex became a careful dance of advancement and retreat, learning to read the Guardian's behavioral patterns while avoiding actions that might trigger more aggressive responses. The preservation systems seemed designed to allow observation and study while preventing removal or damage to the artifacts. But Harold sensed that their tolerance had limits that could be exceeded through carelessness or greed. The deeper chambers revealed the true scope of the Thornfield collection's cultural devastation. Room after room contained artifacts that represented the artistic and spiritual achievements of dozens of indigenous civilizations, arranged with museum-quality presentation that somehow made their theft even more obscene. Each display case included detailed provenance information that documented exactly which communities had been robbed and what cultural significance the stolen objects had possessed. Harold found himself moving through what amounted to a catalog of cultural genocide, viewing treasures that had been ripped from their original contexts and assembled like trophies of conquest. The Thornfield Society's documentation was thorough enough to trace individual pieces back to specific villages and ceremonial sites, creating a paper trail that revealed the systematic nature of their acquisition methods and the devastating impact on the communities they had targeted. The most powerful artifacts were housed in the complex's deepest chambers, protected by increasingly sophisticated guardian systems and preservation mechanisms that suggested the Thornfield Society had understood that they were dealing with objects whose significance transcended simple monetary value. These pieces radiated energy that Harold could feel before he could see them, creating atmospheric disturbances that made the air itself seem to vibrate with accumulated spiritual power. As Harold spent his first night exploring the Thornfield collection, he began to understand Dr. Ashworth's warnings about the artifacts themselves evaluating intruders. The deeper he penetrated into the complex, the more intense became the sense of being observed and judged by intelligences that operated according to principles he couldn't comprehend. The Guardian's behavior became more complex and apparently responsive to Harold's intentions rather than just his actions, suggesting that the chamber's security systems could somehow assess the moral character of those who entered.
The breathing sounds that had drawn Harold to the chamber in the first place intensified as he approached the collection's most sacred artifacts, revealing themselves to be emanations from objects that seemed to maintain some form of conscious awareness despite their separation from their original cultural contexts. These pieces appeared to be calling out for recognition, for understanding, for restoration to the communities that had created them and needed them to maintain their spiritual connections with their ancestors. Standing in the deepest chamber at dawn, surrounded by treasures worth hundreds of millions of dollars but representing incalculable cultural loss, Harold understood that Professor Vanstone's moral framework hadn't been academic philosophy. It had been practical guidance for surviving contact with objects that demanded ethical consideration as the price of access. The Thornfield collection wouldn't simply allow itself to be looted. It would test anyone who sought to claim it, and those found wanting would face consequences that Dr. Ashworth had been wise enough to avoid. The heart of the Thornfield collection resided in a cathedral-like chamber that defied every principle of underground architecture Harold had ever encountered. The space soared 40 feet above his head, supported by natural stone pillars that had been carved into intricate spirals depicting the mythologies of dozens of different civilizations. Bioluminescent formations in the ceiling created the illusion of stars, while carefully positioned mirrors reflected and amplified the light to illuminate displays that took Harold's breath away with their impossible beauty and obvious cultural significance. The centerpiece of the collection dominated the chamber's focal point, an massive obsidian altar surrounded by golden artifacts that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The altar itself was carved from a single piece of volcanic glass larger than anything Harold had imagined could exist, its surface polished to perfect reflectivity despite obvious age that predated European contact with the Americas by centuries. Surrounding the altar were ceremonial objects that represented the pinnacle of pre-Columbian artistic achievement, each piece demonstrating technical mastery that rivaled anything produced by contemporary craftsmen. The documentation system that accompanied each artifact revealed the Thornfield Society's systematic approach to cultural devastation. Detailed photographs showed the original ceremonial context from which objects had been stolen, while acquisition records documented the violence used to overcome indigenous resistance to theft. I found myself reading accounts of sacred sites being dynamited to access buried treasures, of tribal elders being murdered for refusing to reveal the locations of hidden artifacts, and of entire communities being displaced to facilitate archaeological plundering that operated more like military campaigns than scholarly research.
The monetary values recorded in the Thornfield Society's contemporary assessments were staggering, even by early 20th century standards. But Harold's research into current market conditions revealed that the collection's worth had grown exponentially over the intervening decades. Individual pieces that the Society had acquired for thousands of dollars were now valued in the millions, while complete ceremonial sets that they had removed intact from temple complexes represented cultural treasures that contemporary museums would consider literally priceless. The jade serpent crown, positioned at the collection's ceremonial center, exemplified both the artistic achievement and cultural devastation that defined the Thornfield acquisitions. The crown consisted of over 200 individually carved jade pieces assembled into a serpentine headdress that seemed to move and flow despite being crafted from solid stone. According to the accompanying documentation, the crown had served as the ritual regalia for high priests of a Mayan astronomical cult whose mathematical and calendrical knowledge had rivaled anything achieved in the ancient world. The crown's theft had effectively destroyed the cult's ability to maintain their sophisticated astronomical observations, ending a tradition of scientific scholarship that had produced calendrical systems accurate to within minutes across millennia.
The Thornfield Society's acquisition records noted with clinical detachment that the crown's removal had been accomplished by murdering the 3 priests who had refused to surrender it, then dynamiting the observatory temple that had housed their astronomical instruments for over 8 centuries. Harold's examination of the crown revealed technical features that challenged his understanding of both ancient capabilities and contemporary physics. The jade pieces were carved with microscopic precision that shouldn't have been achievable without modern equipment, while the crown's internal structure incorporated what appeared to be crystalline elements that produced harmonic frequencies when exposed to electromagnetic fields. When Harold held his metal detector near the crown, the device registered energy signatures that fluctuated in mathematical patterns too complex to be coincidental. The Golden Codex represented perhaps the most devastating cultural loss in the entire collection, a complete library of Aztec knowledge transcribed onto gold sheets using techniques that had preserved detailed information about medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and spiritual practices that had been lost when Spanish conquistadors destroyed the indigenous educational systems. The codex contained thousands of pages of text in multiple indigenous languages, accompanied by illustrations that demonstrated scientific understanding centuries ahead of European achievements in similar fields. The theft of the Golden Codex had been the Thornfield Society's most ambitious acquisition, requiring a coordinated assault on the hidden archive where Aztec scholars had preserved their civilization's accumulated knowledge during the Spanish conquest. The Society's records documented their systematic murder of the indigenous librarians who had maintained the archive for generations, followed by the complete destruction of the facility to prevent any evidence of the theft from surviving. Harold spent hours examining the codex's contents through protective display cases, using translation guides that Professor Vanstone had compiled to understand fragments of the preserved knowledge. The medical information alone represented treatments and surgical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered by European science for several more centuries, while the astronomical observations included predictive models for celestial events that demonstrated mathematical sophistication equal to anything achieved in the modern world. The sacred mirror of Teotihuacan occupied its own chamber within the collection, protected by guardian systems so sophisticated that Harold initially couldn't determine how to approach it safely. The mirror consisted of a perfectly spherical obsidian surface supported by a framework of silver and turquoise that created optical effects impossible to achieve through conventional means. According to the Thornfield documentation, the mirror had served as the central focus for spiritual practices that connected indigenous communities with their ancestral wisdom across vast distances and time periods. The mirror's theft had required the complete destruction of the ceremonial complex where it had been housed, along with the systematic murder of everyone who had witnessed its removal. The Thornfield Society's records noted that the mirror's original guardians had warned that its removal would sever spiritual connections that had maintained indigenous communities' contact with their ancestors for over a millennium. But the Society had dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition. Harold's first direct encounter with the mirror's properties occurred when he inadvertently stepped within its focal range and found himself experiencing visions that seemed to emerge from the obsidian surface itself. The images showed the mirror's original ceremonial use, revealing spiritual practices that had connected individual communities with a vast network of indigenous knowledge and wisdom that had spanned the entire Western Hemisphere before European contact disrupted these connections. The visions also revealed the consequences of the mirror's theft, showing the gradual deterioration of indigenous communities' spiritual connections as they lost access to ancestral guidance that had sustained their cultures for centuries. Harold witnessed the despair and cultural disintegration that had followed the mirror's removal, understanding for the first time that the Thornfield Society's acquisitions had been acts of spiritual as well as cultural genocide. The crystal skulls of Copan represented the collection's most controversial artifacts, 12 life-size human skulls carved from different varieties of crystal and arranged in a ceremonial circle that created electromagnetic effects powerful enough to interfere with Harold's electronic equipment.
According to the Thornfield documentation, the skulls had served as information storage devices for a Mayan scientific civilization that had achieved technological capabilities rivaling anything in the contemporary world. The skull's theft had required a military-style assault on the research complex where Mayan scientists had been conducting advanced studies in mathematics, astronomy, and what the Thornfield records described as electromagnetic manipulation techniques.
Harold's examination of the crystal skulls revealed technological features that defied explanation through conventional archaeological understanding. The skulls appeared to store and process information using crystalline matrix systems that responded to electromagnetic fields, while their internal structures incorporated optical elements that could project three-dimensional images containing detailed scientific and historical information. As Harold completed his initial survey of the Thornfield collection's major artifacts, he understood that Professor Vanstone's moral framework hadn't been abstract philosophical consideration. These objects represented not just enormous monetary value, but the cultural and spiritual heritage of indigenous communities that had been systematically destroyed to facilitate their acquisition. The collection's worth couldn't be measured simply in dollars. It represented the accumulated knowledge and spiritual power of civilizations that had achieved remarkable heights before European contact interrupted their development. Standing in the cathedral chamber, surrounded by treasures that embodied both extraordinary beauty and unspeakable cultural violence, Harold realized that accessing the Thornfield collection had been the easy part of his journey. Understanding what to do with what he had found would require wisdom that he wasn't sure he possessed, moral courage that he had never been tested to provide, and decisions that would affect not just his family's future, but the spiritual and cultural welfare of indigenous communities throughout the Americas. The true horror of Harold's discovery revealed itself not in the monetary value of the stolen artifacts, but in the detailed records that documented the systematic destruction of indigenous knowledge systems that had taken millennia to develop. Hidden within Professor Vanstone's research materials were translated excerpts from the Thornfield Society's private correspondence, revealing that their acquisitions had been guided not by simple greed, but by a deliberate strategy to eliminate indigenous intellectual achievements that challenged European assumptions about civilization and scientific progress. The Society's internal documents, which Vanstone had somehow obtained during his own investigations, contained explicit discussions about suppressing evidence of indigenous technological and scientific capabilities that exceeded European achievements of the same period. Thornfield members had recognized that public knowledge of Mayan astronomical precision, Aztec medical techniques, or Incan metallurgical innovations would undermine the racial and cultural superiority theories that justified colonial exploitation throughout the Americas. Harold discovered correspondence between Thornfield Society founder, industrialist Ornelius Blackthorne, and prominent anthropologists of the early 1900s, outlining systematic plans to acquire and hide artifacts that demonstrated indigenous scientific sophistication. The primitive narrative must be maintained, Blackthorne had written to colleague Dr. Reginald Ashford in 1902. Public awareness of these civilizations' actual capabilities would create inconvenient questions about our methods of acquisition and our assumptions about cultural hierarchy. Better that such evidence disappear entirely than challenge the intellectual foundations of our enterprise. The Society's acquisition targets had been chosen specifically to eliminate proof of indigenous achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering that would have revolutionized European understanding of human capabilities. The Golden Codex alone contained mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered by European scholars until the 20th century, while the Sacred Mirror of Teotihuacan demonstrated optical engineering principles that contemporary science still couldn't replicate. More devastating was Harold's discovery that the Thornfield Society had deliberately destroyed far more than they had preserved. For every artifact they had acquired, they had systematically demolished libraries, observatories, schools, and research centers that had housed thousands of additional pieces of indigenous intellectual heritage. Their acquisition expeditions had functioned as targeted strikes against indigenous knowledge systems, designed to ensure that evidence of sophisticated non-European civilizations would never reach public awareness.
The personal testimonies that Professor Vanstone had collected from survivors of Thornfield expeditions provided heartbreaking accounts of cultural devastation that extended far beyond simple theft. Harold read translations of interviews with elderly indigenous people who had witnessed the destruction of their community's intellectual centers, describing the murder of scholars, the burning of libraries, and the systematic elimination of educational institutions that had preserved accumulated knowledge for generations. They came not just for our gold and jade, but for our books, our star charts, our medicine scrolls, our mathematical tablets. They killed our teachers and burned our schools, saying that we had no right to possess such knowledge. They told us we were too primitive to understand what we had created, even as they stole the proof of our understanding. The realization that struck Harold most forcefully was that the Thornfield collection represented only a tiny fraction of what had been lost. The artifacts in the chamber were trophies that the society had preserved as proof of their successful elimination of indigenous intellectual heritage, while the vast majority of materials they had acquired had been destroyed to prevent any possibility of their eventual discovery and study. Harold's research into the original cultural contexts of the stolen artifacts revealed the profound spiritual and practical significance that their removal had had on indigenous communities. The jade serpent crown hadn't just been a ceremonial object, it had been an essential component of astronomical observations that had guided agricultural planning for hundreds of communities across Central America. Its theft had disrupted food production systems that had sustained millions of people, contributing to famines and population dispersals that had lasting effects on regional demographics. The sacred mirror of Teotihuacan had served as the central communication device for a network of indigenous communities that had maintained cultural and spiritual connections across thousands of miles. Its removal had severed these connections, isolating communities that had previously shared knowledge, resources, and mutual support during times of crisis. The mirror's theft had effectively destroyed a continental civilization by eliminating the communication system that had held it together. The crystal skulls of Copan had been information storage devices for an advanced scientific civilization that had been developing technologies that might have changed the course of human history. Their acquisition had eliminated indigenous research into electromagnetic phenomena, crystalline information storage, and optical engineering that was centuries ahead of European capabilities. The knowledge contained within the skills might have led to breakthroughs in energy production, communication, and medical technology that would have completely rewritten the course of history.
Technological breakthroughs that could have prevented or mitigated many of the environmental and social problems that plagued the contemporary world. Harold's growing understanding of the collection's true significance created a moral crisis that went far beyond his family's immediate financial needs. The artifacts weren't just valuable objects that could solve his personal problems. They were essential components of indigenous cultural and spiritual systems that had been functioning continuously for centuries before their violent removal. Communities throughout Central and South America were still suffering from the cultural disruption that had resulted from the Thornfield Society's systematic destruction of their intellectual heritage. The contemporary indigenous rights movement had been working for decades to reclaim cultural artifacts that had been stolen during the colonial period, but their efforts were hampered by the fact that most stolen objects had disappeared into private collections or had been destroyed entirely. The Thornfield collection represented the largest intact assemblage of indigenous cultural property known to exist, but it also represented evidence of cultural genocide that had been hidden from public awareness for over a century. Harold's research into current repatriation law revealed that international treaties and domestic legislation provided clear frameworks for returning stolen cultural property to indigenous communities, but they also established criminal liability for anyone who possessed such property without proper legal authorization. Accessing the Thornfield collection had made Harold a party to cultural crimes that had been committed over a century earlier, creating legal exposure that could result in federal prosecution even if his intentions were entirely honest.
The documentation that Professor Vanstone had compiled included contact information for indigenous rights organizations and tribal councils throughout the Americas, along with detailed plans for repatriating the collection's contents according to proper cultural protocols. But Vanstone's research also revealed the political and legal obstacles that had prevented such repatriation efforts from succeeding in the past, including resistance from governments and institutions that benefited from maintaining control over indigenous cultural property. Harold's moral awakening reached its climax when he discovered that several pieces in the Thornfield collection were still actively used in contemporary indigenous spiritual practices, despite their century-long absence from their original communities. The sacred mirror of Teotihuacan continued to appear in the dreams and visions of traditional healers throughout Mexico, who had maintained spiritual connections with the artifact across generations of separation. The crystal skulls of Copan were still invoked in Mayan ceremonies that attempted to access the knowledge they contained, though without physical access to the artifacts, these ceremonies remained incomplete. The breathing sounds that had originally drawn Harold to the chamber were revealed to be emanations from artifacts that maintained some form of conscious awareness despite their separation from their cultural contexts. The objects were literally calling out for restoration to the communities that had created them and needed them to maintain their spiritual and intellectual traditions. The sounds grew stronger whenever Harold approached artifacts that were particularly significant to ongoing indigenous practices, as if the objects themselves were directing his attention toward the most urgent cases for repatriation. Standing in the cathedral chamber, surrounded by evidence of cultural devastation that exceeded anything he had imagined possible, Harold understood that his discovery of the Thornfield collection hadn't been coincidental. The artifacts had been calling to him, drawing him toward a responsibility that transcended his personal financial crisis and connected him to historical injustices that demanded immediate correction. Professor Vanstone had spent his life preparing for a moment of moral choice that he had never gotten to face, leaving Harold to inherit not just the location of extraordinary treasures, but the obligation to use them in service of justice rather than personal gain. The $380 million valuation that had initially seemed like salvation now felt like a measure of cultural devastation that couldn't be corrected through monetary transactions. The true value of the collection lay not in what it could bring at auction, but in what its restoration could mean for indigenous communities that had spent over a century mourning the loss of their cultural and spiritual heritage. Harold's transformation from desperate treasure hunter to guardian of stolen heritage was complete. But understanding his responsibility was only the beginning of a journey that would require him to navigate complex legal, political, and spiritual challenges that could restore justice or destroy everything he had left to lose. Harold's decision to contact the indigenous communities whose heritage lay stolen in the chamber beneath his property marked the beginning of the most challenging period of his life, but also the moment when his transformation from desperate man to cultural guardian became irreversible. Using the contact information that Professor Vanstone had compiled, Harold spent sleepless nights making phone calls to tribal councils, indigenous rights organizations, and cultural preservation groups throughout Central and South America, attempting to explain his discovery without revealing enough details to attract unwanted attention from treasure hunters or government officials. The first response came from Dr. Maria Ixchel, a Mayan cultural specialist at the University of Guatemala who served as an advisor to traditional communities seeking to reclaim their ancestral heritage. Her initial skepticism dissolved when Harold described specific artifacts mentioned in oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of ceremonial keepers, including details about the jade serpent crown that weren't documented in any public sources. Dr. Ixchel's voice trembled with emotion when Harold confirmed the continued existence of objects that her people had mourned as lost forever.
The crown of the Star Watchers has been calling to our dream singers for over a century, Dr. Ixchel explained during their third conversation. Our astronomical ceremonies have been incomplete without it, and our calendar keepers have struggled to maintain accuracy in their predictions. If what you describe is truly the crown that was stolen from the Temple of Eternal Cycles, then you have found the heart of our people's connection to celestial wisdom. The complexity of organizing repatriation efforts became apparent as Harold contacted additional communities and discovered that many artifacts in the Thornfield collection had been sacred to multiple indigenous groups whose territories had overlapped or who had shared ceremonial practices. The sacred mirror of Teotihuacan, for instance, had been central to spiritual networks that had connected over 50 different communities across what is now Mexico and Central America. Returning the mirror to its proper role would require coordination between tribal councils that hadn't collaborated extensively since before European contact. Harold's house became an informal headquarters for repatriation planning as indigenous representatives began traveling to Oregon to verify the authenticity of artifacts that their communities had believed lost forever. Each visitor brought both expertise in their cultural traditions and deep emotional connection to objects that had been absent from their ceremonial lives for generations. Harold watched elderly ceremonial keepers weep as they confirmed the presence of artifacts that had appeared to them in dreams and visions throughout their lifetimes. The legal challenges surrounding repatriation proved as complex as the cultural considerations. International law clearly supported indigenous claims to stolen cultural property, but the practical mechanisms for transferring artifacts that had been hidden for over a century required navigation of bureaucratic systems that weren't designed to handle discoveries of this magnitude. Harold found himself working with attorneys who specialized in cultural repatriation, UNESCO representatives, and government officials from multiple countries, all while trying to maintain secrecy about the collection's location until proper security measures could be established. The most immediate threat came from treasure hunters and private collectors who had somehow learned about Harold's contacts with indigenous communities. His phone calls and email communications had apparently attracted attention from networks that monitored such activities, hoping to intercept valuable artifacts before they could be officially repatriated. Harold discovered surveillance equipment hidden around his property and noticed unfamiliar vehicles conducting regular drive-bys that suggested professional investigation rather than casual curiosity. The danger escalated when Harold's family became targets of intimidation efforts designed to pressure him into revealing the chamber's contents. Esperanza received threatening phone calls at the hospital, warning her to convince her husband to be reasonable about sharing his good fortune. Gabriela was followed home from school by men who made no effort to conceal their surveillance, creating fear that transformed the family's daily routines into careful security protocols. Harold's transformation from victim of economic circumstances to protector of cultural heritage required him to develop skills and knowledge he had never needed during his previous life as a landscaper. He learned about indigenous spiritual practices, international cultural law, artifact authentication techniques, and security measures necessary to protect priceless objects from theft. The engineering background that had seemed irrelevant to his landscaping career proved invaluable in understanding the technical challenges of preserving and transporting artifacts that had remained stable for over a century. The financial irony of Harold's situation became more apparent as repatriation planning progressed. The artifacts that could have solved his family's immediate financial crisis were generating expenses that pushed them deeper into debt. Security consultations, legal fees, travel costs for indigenous representatives, and specialized equipment for artifact documentation were consuming resources that Harold's family couldn't afford even as they worked to return treasures worth hundreds of millions of dollars to their rightful communities.
Esperanza's initial confusion about Harold's decision evolved into supportive understanding as she witnessed the emotional impact of repatriation on indigenous visitors to their home. Watching elderly ceremonial keepers reconnect with sacred objects that had been missing from their spiritual practices for generations helped her understand that Harold's choice involved obligations that transcended personal financial considerations. Her nursing background had taught her to recognize healing processes, and she could see that the artifact returns were addressing cultural wounds that had festered for over a century. Gabriella's response to her father's transformation surprised everyone in the family. Rather than resenting the sacrifice of potential financial security, she became fascinated by the cultural and historical significance of the repatriation process. Her fluency with social media and research techniques proved invaluable in documenting artifacts and coordinating with indigenous communities, while her generation's comfort with technology established secure communication channels that protected sensitive information from interception. The first official repatriation ceremony was planned for the autumn equinox, when celestial alignments would recreate the celestial alignments that had been significant to many of the artifact's original ceremonial uses. Representatives from 12 indigenous communities would gather at Harold's property to witness the return of objects that had been central to their spiritual and cultural practices. The ceremony would also serve as a legal transfer that would establish proper custody of the artifacts while protecting Harold from criminal liability for having possessed stolen cultural property. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were consumed with security preparations that transformed Harold's rural property into a protected site capable of hosting one of the most significant cultural repatriation events in modern history. Federal marshals provided security coordination, while UNESCO representatives documented the transfer process to ensure compliance with international treaties governing cultural property. Media attention was carefully managed to prevent the ceremony from becoming a spectacle while still acknowledging the historical significance of the artifact's return.
Harold's relationship with Professor Vanstone's legacy deepened as he implemented the scholar's repatriation protocols and discovered additional research materials that had been hidden throughout the property. Vanstone had spent decades preparing for this moment, developing relationships with indigenous communities and legal frameworks that would enable responsible return of the Thornfield collection. Harold was fulfilling not just moral obligations, but carrying forward work that the professor had initiated but never completed. The transformation of Harold's family from victims of economic collapse to guardians of cultural heritage was completed in the days before the repatriation ceremony. Their house, which had been facing foreclosure just months earlier, was now protected by federal security measures and designated as a temporary cultural preservation site. The land that Harold had been about to lose was being purchased by a consortium of indigenous organizations and cultural preservation groups, ensuring that the chamber would remain accessible for ongoing repatriation efforts, while providing Harold's family with financial security that honored rather than exploited their discovery. Standing in the chamber on the night before the ceremony, surrounded by artifacts that would soon return to their proper cultural contexts, Harold understood that his journey from broken landscaper to cultural guardian had prepared him for responsibilities that would define the rest of his life. The Thornfield collection's repatriation would establish precedents for similar cases throughout the Americas, while Harold's role in the process had connected him to a community of indigenous activists, cultural preservationists, and legal advocates who would continue working together on related projects. The breathing sounds that had first drawn Harold to the chamber had grown stronger as the repatriation ceremony approached, as if the artifacts themselves were anticipating their return to active spiritual use. The chamber that had served as a prison for stolen heritage was about to become a bridge between past and present, enabling indigenous communities to reconnect with cultural traditions that had been interrupted but never destroyed by the Thornfield Society's systematic cultural violence. The autumn equinox ceremony that would restore the Thornfield collection to its rightful communities brought representatives from indigenous groups throughout the Americas to Harold's property, transforming the rural Oregon hillside into a gathering place that bridged centuries of cultural separation. The delegation included ceremonial keepers who had maintained oral traditions about the stolen artifacts despite never having seen them, linguists who specialized in pre-Columbian languages, and spiritual leaders whose communities had adapted their practices to accommodate the absence of sacred objects that were finally coming home. The morning of the ceremony dawned with atmospheric conditions that seemed to amplify the spiritual significance of what was about to unfold. Mist rose from the valley below Harold's property, creating ethereal clouds that caught the early sunlight and transformed the landscape into something that felt more mythical than mundane. The chamber's entrance, which had been sealed for over a century, stood open for the first time since the Thornfield Society had hidden their stolen treasures beneath the Oregon soil. Elder Itzal Morales, the oldest living member of the Quiche Maya community whose astronomical crown was central to the day's ceremonies, arrived wearing traditional ceremonial dress that hadn't been seen in public for generations. At 93, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent her entire life maintaining cultural traditions despite systematic attempts to suppress indigenous practices. Her presence legitimized the repatriation process while connecting it to unbroken chains of cultural transmission that had survived centuries of colonial oppression. The legal framework that governed the ceremony had required months of international coordination to establish. UNESCO representatives worked alongside attorneys from the Native American Rights Fund, Mexican Cultural Ministry officials, and legal specialists in cultural repatriation to create documentation that would satisfy both indigenous sovereignty requirements and contemporary international law. The ceremony wasn't just a spiritual event, it was a legally binding transfer of cultural property that would establish precedents for similar cases throughout the Western Hemisphere. Harold's role in the ceremony had evolved far beyond simple facilitation to become something approaching cultural translation. His months of intensive education about indigenous history, spiritual practices, and contemporary political issues had prepared him to serve as an intermediary between different communities whose approaches to reclaiming their heritage sometimes conflicted with each other. The engineering mindset that once focused on soil composition and plant biology now tackled the complex logistics of coordinating between groups that spoke different languages and followed different protocols. The first challenge came when government officials from both the United States and Mexico attempted to assert national claims over artifacts that predated their respective political entities by centuries. Federal attorneys argued that objects found within American territory belonged to American museums, while Mexican representatives claimed that artifacts created by pre-Columbian civilizations constituted Mexican national patrimony, regardless of where they had been discovered. The indigenous representatives responded with documentation proving that their communities had maintained continuous cultural connections to the artifacts that superseded any claims based on colonial or post-colonial political boundaries. The confrontation escalated when private collectors, alerted by media coverage despite security measures, arrived with legal documentation claiming ownership of specific pieces based on transactions that allegedly occurred during the early 20th century. These collectors produced bills of sale, insurance records, and provenance documentation, suggesting that some Thornfield Society members had sold individual artifacts to private buyers before the collection was sealed in the Oregon Chamber.
The breakthrough came when Elder Morales addressed the assembled crowds, government officials, and media representatives in a speech that reframed the entire debate about artifact ownership. Speaking in Quiche Maya with translation provided by Dr. Ixchel, she explained that the artifacts weren't property in any sense that Western legal systems could comprehend. They were living elements of spiritual practices that had been maintained by indigenous communities despite their physical absence. "These objects do not belong to us," Elder Morales declared, her voice carrying across the hillside with authority that silenced even the most aggressive government officials. "We belong to them. They are our teachers, our connection to ancestral wisdom, our guides for maintaining balance between earthly and celestial realms. You cannot own our teachers any more than you can own the wind or the stars. You can only choose whether to honor them or continue the violence that separated them from their purpose."
The power of Elder Morales' speech was amplified by phenomena that occurred as she spoke. The jade serpent crown, which had been carefully transported from the chamber for the ceremony, began to emit harmonic frequencies that were audible across the gathering. The sacred mirror of Teotihuacan created optical effects that projected images of pre-Columbian astronomical observations onto clouds above the crowd. The crystal skulls of Copan generated electromagnetic fields strong enough to interfere with electronic equipment, forcing camera crews and recording devices to shut down spontaneously. These demonstrations of the artifact's continued spiritual power convinced even skeptical government officials that they were dealing with objects that transcended normal categories of cultural property. Federal attorneys withdrew their claims after consulting with supervisors who recognized that attempting to enforce Western property law over spiritually active indigenous artifacts could create political crises that extended far beyond the immediate legal issues. The actual transfer of artifacts from Harold's custody to indigenous representatives took place according to protocols that had been developed through careful consultation between different communities. Each object was ceremonially cleansed to remove the spiritual contamination that resulted from its century-long separation from proper cultural contexts, then formally returned to designated keepers who would oversee its reintegration into active spiritual practices. Harold's personal transformation reached its culmination as he participated in ceremonies that formally recognized his role as a bridge between the colonial violence that had stolen the artifacts and the contemporary justice that was returning them. Indigenous representatives presented him with a ceremonial staff carved from wood that had grown above the chamber, symbolizing his acceptance into extended communities that had been reunited through his willingness to prioritize cultural healing over personal gain. The most emotionally powerful moment came when the jade serpent crown was placed on Elder Morales' head for the first time in over a century. The crown seemed to recognize its proper wearer, adjusting its weight and balance to fit perfectly despite the physical changes that had occurred during its long absence. Elder Morales wore the crown while performing astronomical observations that had been impossible to complete accurately without the artifact's mathematical precision, demonstrating the practical as well as spiritual significance of the repatriation. The ceremony's conclusion brought legal resolution to issues that had threatened to prevent the artifact's return. International courts ruled that indigenous communities had demonstrated continuous cultural ownership of the artifacts despite their physical absence, while governments agreed to provide protection and support for repatriation efforts rather than asserting competing claims. The precedents established during Harold's case would facilitate similar returns throughout the Americas, potentially affecting thousands of artifacts that remained hidden in private collections or institutional storage. As sunset marked the end of the equinox ceremony, Harold stood with his family beside the chamber that had transformed their lives and witnessed the departure of indigenous representatives who were carrying their ancestral heritage home for the first time in over a century. The property that had faced foreclosure 6 months earlier was now protected as a cultural preservation site, while Harold's role in the repatriation process had connected him to ongoing work that would provide both financial stability and spiritual meaning for the rest of his life. The breathing sounds that had originally drawn Harold to the chamber had stopped completely, replaced by silence that felt peaceful rather than ominous. The artifacts had returned to their proper relationships with the communities that had created and maintained them, ending the spiritual distress that had emanated from objects separated from their cultural contexts. The chamber would remain accessible for future repatriation efforts, but its primary purpose had been fulfilled through Harold's willingness to serve justice rather than exploit his discovery for personal gain. 2 years after the repatriation ceremony that had transformed his life from desperate failure to cultural guardian, Harold Ruiz sat in his new office at the Indigenous Heritage Recovery Institute, a position that had evolved naturally from his role in returning the Thornfield collection to its rightful communities. The office, located in a renovated building in downtown Portland, served as headquarters for an organization that had grown from Harold's initial discovery into a continental network dedicated to locating and repatriating indigenous artifacts throughout the Americas. The institute operated with funding from foundations, government grants, and donations from collectors who had discovered that artifacts in their possession had been acquired through illegal means during the colonial and post-colonial periods. Harold's transformation from landscaper to cultural preservationist had required him to develop expertise in international law, archaeological authentication, indigenous spiritual practices, and the complex logistics of coordinating repatriation efforts across multiple countries and legal jurisdictions. The work had proven both emotionally rewarding and intellectually challenging in ways that his previous career had never approached. Each case presented unique puzzles that combined historical research, legal analysis, and cultural sensitivity, requiring solutions that satisfied contemporary legal requirements while respecting indigenous sovereignty and spiritual protocols. Harold's engineering background had proven surprisingly relevant to authentication work, as his training in systematic analysis and problem-solving translated effectively to the methodical investigation required for tracing artifacts back to their original cultural contexts.
The Institute's most recent success had involved the return of Olmec jade carvings that had been stolen from Mexican archaeological sites during the 1960s and sold to private collectors throughout the United States. Harold had spent months working with Mexican government officials, Olmec cultural descendants, and American museum directors to negotiate a repatriation agreement that satisfied all parties while establishing legal precedents for future cases. The complexity of the negotiations had required Harold to serve simultaneously as cultural translator, legal mediator, and diplomatic coordinator. Esperanza had found her own role within the expanding network of cultural preservation organizations that had grown around Harold's work. Her nursing background had proven invaluable in providing medical support for elderly indigenous ceremonial keepers who traveled long distances to participate in repatriation ceremonies, while her administrative skills had made her essential to the Institute's operations management. The couple's relationship had been strengthened by shared purpose that honored both their individual capabilities and their mutual commitment to serving communities beyond their own immediate needs. Gabriella had completed her first year at Oregon State University with a full scholarship provided by the Institute's Educational Foundation, studying environmental science with a focus on traditional ecological knowledge preserved by indigenous communities. Her generation's comfort with technology and social media had made her instrumental in documenting repatriation processes and maintaining communication networks between widely scattered indigenous groups. The college education that had seemed impossible during her family's financial crisis was now funded through work that connected her academic interests with meaningful social impact. The property on Clearwater Road had been transformed into a permanent cultural preservation site that served multiple functions within the broader repatriation network. The chamber beneath the hillside now housed a rotating collection of artifacts awaiting return to their proper communities, while the house above ground provided temporary accommodation for indigenous representatives participating in recovery efforts. The land that Harold had nearly lost to foreclosure was now protected through conservation easements that ensured its continued availability for cultural preservation work. The financial security that Harold's family had achieved through their repatriation work exceeded anything they could have gained by selling the Thornfield collection for personal profit. Harold's salary as Institute Director, combined with consulting fees for authentication work and speaking honoraria from universities and museums, provided comfortable middle-class income that met their needs without requiring the moral compromises that would have accompanied treasure hunting. More importantly, the work connected them to extended communities throughout the Americas that had welcomed them as family members rather than simply professional colleagues. The international recognition that Harold had received for his role in cultural preservation included honorary doctorates from universities in Mexico, Guatemala, and Peru, along with awards from indigenous rights organizations and cultural preservation societies. But the recognition that meant most to Harold came from ceremonial keepers and traditional elders who continued to visit the Institute, bringing news of how returned artifacts were revitalizing spiritual practices and strengthening cultural transmission between generations. The Institute's expanding work had revealed the enormous scope of cultural theft that had occurred throughout the Americas during the colonial and post-colonial periods.
Harold's investigation techniques had been adopted by similar organizations throughout Latin America, leading to discoveries of hidden collections and private hoards that contained thousands of additional stolen artifacts. The network that had grown around Harold's initial discovery was facilitating returns that were healing cultural wounds that had festered for centuries. The most recent development in Harold's work involved collaboration with technology companies that were developing non-invasive scanning techniques for locating hidden chambers and concealed collections without damaging archaeological sites. Harold's experience with the Thornfield Chamber had made him a valuable consultant for projects that combined traditional archaeological methods with cutting-edge detection technology, potentially revolutionizing the field of cultural recovery. Harold's personal transformation from failed businessman to respected cultural advocate had required him to confront aspects of American history that his previous education had never addressed honestly. His work with indigenous communities had educated him about the systematic violence that had accompanied European colonization and the ongoing effects of cultural theft on contemporary indigenous societies. This education had been emotionally difficult, but intellectually essential for understanding the full significance of repatriation work. The speaking engagements that now comprised part of Harold's professional responsibilities took him to universities, museums, and conferences throughout North America, where he addressed audiences about the intersection of personal ethics and historical justice. His story resonated particularly strongly with middle-aged professionals who were seeking more meaningful work, demonstrating that significant career transitions were possible even during periods of economic uncertainty. The legacy that Harold was building through his repatriation work extended beyond the specific artifacts that had been returned to their proper communities. The legal precedents established through his cases were strengthening indigenous rights to cultural property, while the authentication methods he had helped develop were being taught in university programs throughout the Americas. The network of relationships he had facilitated between different indigenous communities was enabling collaboration on cultural preservation projects that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. The chamber beneath Harold's property remained an active site for ongoing repatriation work, serving as a temporary way station for artifacts that were being returned to communities throughout Central and South America. The space that once imprisoned stolen cultural heritage now functioned as a liberation center where objects could be properly documented, ceremonially cleansed, and prepared for return to active spiritual use.
As Harold reflected on the journey that had transformed his life from personal crisis to cultural service, he understood that the breathing sounds that had originally drawn him to the chamber had been more than acoustic phenomena. They had been calls for justice that connected him to historical obligations that transcended personal financial needs. The desperation that had initially motivated his investigation had been replaced by purpose that would sustain him for the rest of his life. Standing in his office on a rainy Portland evening, Harold could see the lights of indigenous community centers, legal aid organizations, and cultural preservation groups that comprised the network he had helped create. The broken man who had contemplated breaking into an ancient chamber to solve his financial problems had become a bridge between worlds, facilitating healing that honored both individual dignity and collective justice. The transformation was complete, but the work would continue for generations, ensuring that cultural heritage stolen through violence could be restored through wisdom, patience, and unwavering commitment to serving communities whose voices had been silenced too long. The office walls displayed photographs from repatriation ceremonies throughout the Americas, each image capturing moments when communities had been reunited with ancestral heritage that they had never stopped mourning. These photographs represented Harold's true wealth, connections to people and purposes that measured success through healing rather than accumulation, through service rather than acquisition, through justice rather than profit. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.